If you've heard the news of friendships blossoming in the Middle East, you heard correctly. Some historical rivals are finally cooling their beef and becoming pals again. Iran and Saudi Arabia are brokering a peace deal with the help of China, and it's gonna have some wild outcomes for the rest of the world, but the arbitrator in particular. We're seeing the birth of an entirely new Middle East. How? Well, let's dive into it. Iran and Saudi Arabia have had some rough relations in the past. They weren't exactly the best of friends. In fact, they were quite the enemies. They found each other on the opposite sides of wars again and again. One conflict in recent history is the still ongoing Yemeni civil war, where the Saudi Arabian government launched an air war against Houthi rebels back in 2015. The same rebels that Iran has repeatedly armed and aided, mind you. So it's kinda rough when your neighbor's making things harder for you. But the war against the Houthi rebels didn't stop there. Because of each country's constant support of opposite sides, they've both suffered immense losses, not just inside Yemen, but the fight is spilling outside too. Houthi rebels attacked Saudi-owned oil refineries and airports using drones and missiles. The Yemeni civil war resulted in the loss of the lives of over 150,000 people, which included about 15,000 civilians. So it's not just some small bump in the road for these two states to get over, it's a major diplomatic issue. All in all, the Yemen conflict has not been the best case of camaraderie between Iran and Saudi Arabia. But on the bright side, the two reached a ceasefire agreement back in 2022. And on the not-so-bright side, this ceasefire kinda expired in October 2022. And it's not just Yemen. These two have been on opposite sides in Syria, Lebanon, and even Iraq, which is why this peace arrangement is actually a groundbreaking deal for both countries. It's not easy letting go of years of violence and bloodshed in favor of peace. Saudi Arabia and Iran have been on each other's bad side for decades, so it's not like they're going to just instantly call it quits one day and become friends. But that's where China comes in. China helped broker the peace deal in the first place, and it was unlikely that these two countries were ever going to reach a peaceful agreement by themselves or with America. All this started in February 2023 when the president of Iran, Ibrahim Raisi, visited China for the first time in more than 20 years. Raisi and Xi Jinping got talking about the rough situation in the Middle East, and the two started to see eye to eye on how they could help each other calm down the tensions between the powers of the Gulf, and perhaps start building up economic avenues that are outside the U.S. influence. For that sort of diplomatic relations, regional peace becomes a requisite, right? Fast forward to March, and China arbitrated peace between KSA and Iran. So now, thanks to this deal that's been negotiated in Beijing, Saudi Arabia and Iran are on their way to becoming more friendly with one another, at least temporarily. This is the first time in 7 years that they're patching things up and restoring diplomatic ties. What this means is that the two countries are going to be turning the lights on in their respective embassies and finally start talking to each other again. Seems like they're hitting the reset button on their rivalries, and the US can do nothing but watch, even if President Biden says he's going to bring more peace to the Middle East. So we've finally stopped the war, and now we're on our way to a better and brighter world, right? Well, it's a little more complicated than that. See, Iran has agreed again and again that they'll stop supporting the Houthis in Yemen. But they didn't really mention that part in the joint statement all three countries gave regarding the peace deal. So it's really uncertain if Iran actually goes through with it, at least from Saudi Arabia's point of view. The thing about this deal is that it's just a restoration of diplomatic ties. It could lead to peace in the future, but for now it's just the start. One thing's for sure, this deal is a major boost to both countries, especially Iran. Iran's been having a really rough time in early 2023. You've got massive waves of protest over human rights violations, US-backed sanctions over their nuclear program, and then Iran has openly supported Russia in the Ukraine war. So when it comes to restoring your global image, the peace deal will help. On top of that, Saudi Arabia is going to go a little bit easier on Iran on the international news front, with less hard-hitting critique coming from Saudi-funded news channels clearly pushing to put the propaganda on Iran. This could help cool down their relations even more. China realized that the US wasn't exactly the best patron or ally in this region. Knowing that, they decided to build some ties and relations with the top dogs in the Middle East. And all that effort is paying off right before our eyes with this peace deal. And it makes sense for China to become stronger allies with their friends in the Middle East. See, the Russia-Ukraine war has really turned the world's energy market upside down, and you got to get your fill of oil somehow, so you try to get some stable suppliers in the Middle East. After all, China gets a lot of its oil from Iran and Saudi Arabia, about 40%, so they're a top buyer, practically running an economy on the Gulf oil. So you got to make sure that your dealers aren't getting into any trouble with each other. This deal allows a little more safety when it comes to supply lines for goods and oil, which is obviously a plus for China. But what's even better for them is how they're undermining the US's influence in this region. The US has been around this region for roughly 75 years, and even they couldn't act as a mediator for this peace deal. It goes to show that maybe the amount of time the US spent in this region wasn't worth it, but either way, it's quite the shakeup in global politics. At least the US is still the most important security provider in the Middle East. And China is changing that, of course. And this isn't just a series of wacky coincidences either. China's been gunning to be an alternative to the US when it comes to the global scene. Now countries are starting to have more options when it comes to middlemen brokering deals for you. China just seemed to work better for these countries than the US, especially when it comes to finding more stable markets for their oil that don't necessarily deal in dollars. Why would Iran want to do that? China's a big buyer, so it makes sense that you want to show them that you mean business. And making peace with one of your biggest enemies really shows that you mean business. Saudi Arabia, on the other hand, is just acting smart. They don't want to depend completely on the US for their oil markets, and by accepting China's helping hand, they're pretty much showing the world that they're not just America's right-hand man. They want the technology and resources that come with being pals with Xi Jinping. We know that the US-China trade war is in its new age. For China, they're going to be buying even more oil and gas from the Gulf, strengthening the ties they have with Saudi Arabia and boosting their economy, especially if Middle Eastern states start selling their oil in Chinese yuan instead of the US dollar. Replacing the petrodollar has been China's greatest economic aspiration, especially in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis. It has encouraged the use of more stable currency that doesn't always get in the middle of sanctions and tariffs. With global initiatives like One Belt, One Road, trading in yuan is going to be a tad bit easier. And if you have major oil-producing states on your side, what else would you want? More importantly, though, if this deal leads to peace in Yemen, that's going to raise China's political respect even more than it already has. Putting an end to an 8 years long conflict is going to show the world that China can get stuff done diplomatically. And from then on, who knows what sort of moves China can make on this turf? Could they even cool down tensions between Palestine and Israel? So, what do you guys think? Feel free to take a dive in the comments below. Leave a like if you enjoyed watching this video, and be sure to check out our next one.